"Stop right there! I told you to back off!" The officer snarled, roughly twisting the arm of the woman in a stylish orange blazer, pinning her against the cold wall of the opulent restaurant. He tightened the handcuffs, whispering contemptuously into her ear. "People like you always think the law doesn't apply to them." But his triumphant smile vanished at the police station when the identification screen displayed a name that stunned the entire precinct into silence. The handcuffed woman was no criminal. It was Elizabeth Sanders, a federal judge who had held the power of life and death in civil rights courts for over 20 years. A covertly filmed video clip ignited a ticking time bomb in the heart of Atlanta, turning a wrongful arrest into an earthquake that unearthed the mass graves of the past. From this brutal, covert arrest, quotas and the unjust death of her father 30 years prior began to surface from the shadows, exposing the rot to its very core. When the one holding the scales of justice becomes a victim, will she shatter this corrupt system, or merely ignite a war where the enemy has already laid the trap? If this were your mother, pinned against a wall and handcuffed just because of racial bias, how long would you stand for it? Tell us your thoughts, and watch the full video to find out what happens next. Buckhead at noon was drenched in sunlight pouring through the thick glass of the diner, casting a sharp glow on Marjorie Hale's orange blazer, making her stand out in a room full of well-dressed white patrons, leisurely enjoying lunch. The kind of people used to having the world laid out just right for them. Marjorie stood at the counter, holding her receipt. Her manner gentle but firm, enough for anyone watching to know she wasn't the type to make a scene. And yet the way they glanced at her carried a different weight. The kind of look you give someone who seems out of place. Someone who doesn't quite belong in Atlanta's most expensive zip code. The server tried to act normal, but his eyes kept darting around, while an older couple at a table near the door whispered they'd never seen her around here before. Everything was calm until the door swung open hard, slamming the bell into a loud jingle. Brent Lawson stepped in, his shadow swallowing the walkway as he'd just come off a battlefield instead of a parking lot. He walked with purpose, black shoes striking the floor hard, his face red either from anger or from the habit of thinking the entire neighborhood revolved around him. His eyes swept the room slowly, like he was inspecting inmates in a cell block. Some dropped their eyes to the menu without reading a word. Others pretended not to notice. Just the way he carried himself made it clear. Something was about to happen. He touched his gun belt, not drawing the weapon, just brushing it enough to be a warning. The order of this place belonged to him. When Lawson's eyes locked on Marjorie, his posture changed, like he'd just found the thing that didn't fit in the room. He stood a few steps away, head tilted, eyes narrowing. Without asking a single question, he walked straight to the counter with sharp, purposeful strides. The manager, watching from the kitchen corner, held his breath. No one had called Lawson. There'd only been some vague complaint earlier, but Lawson acted like that was all the justification he needed. He came up close behind her, standing so near she could feel his quickened breath. His voice was low, but it cut like a blade. "Step back from the counter." The words snapped out fast, forceful, as if she were in his way while he did his job. Marjorie turned her head calmly. She didn't react defensively or in a rush. She just said evenly, "I'm just paying my bill, officer." That sentence lit something behind Lawson's eyes. He was used to fear or flustered explanations, not calm words from a black woman around 50. Standing her ground like this wasn't a scene. He stepped in closer, just enough for his tone to drop heavier. "You heard me the first time. Step back." Some diners started to take notice. A few glanced at each other. One man muttered that maybe she was cutting in line. Instead of questioning the officer, they looked at her with suspicion, already trained to think the black person must be the problem. The noon light lit up Marjorie's face, heightening the contrast between her and Lawson. She stood tall, still holding the receipt, unmoved. He stood rigid, shoulders tensed, carrying the wounded pride of a man who thought his authority had just been challenged. His voice sharpened, frustration clear. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." More people in the diner turned fully to look, but no one said anything. Even though the scene clearly didn't feel right, what kept them quiet was familiarity. The unspoken rule that confronting a cop means trouble. The air in the room thickened, like it was pushing down on the woman standing alone. A young customer at a table near the door quietly lifted his phone, pretending to adjust the angle as if taking a photo of his meal. But his lens was clearly pointed at Marjorie and Lawson. He'd felt that stare from Lawson too many times, the kind of stare that could turn anyone into a suspect. Marjorie noticed the small movement, but said nothing. She'd lived through enough of these moments to know exactly what the eyes in this diner were thinking. A younger white woman leaned over to her friend and whispered, "Maybe the officer had a reason," while the man across from her nodded and murmured, "Folks like that always cause something." The whispers weren't loud, but they were enough to isolate her enough to place Marjorie into her own corner, cut off from everyone else, right in the middle of the room. Lawson shifted his stance, tilting his head slightly to the right, as if to see whether she was afraid. When she remained still, his expression changed, clearly irritated. His next words came out almost on instinct. "Last warning." The entire diner held its breath at those words, because they knew that just one raised eyebrow or a wrong breath from her could bring everything crashing down. Even the sound of a spoon scraping ice in a glass at the corner of the room stopped. A server stared at Lawson's hands, waiting to see if he would reach for the cuffs. Everyone's focus narrowed to the moment between the two of them. The moment where the stink of racial prejudice showed itself without needing to be spelled out. Marjorie kept her voice steady, eyes unblinking. "I'm just paying for my lunch." Her words felt like gasoline thrown on the man in front of her. He hated that calm, hated the feeling that he was being challenged. An older man at the next table gave a slight shake of his head and muttered, "She should have just stepped back." The quiet comment carried the loaded assumption that she was the one responsible for the officer's discomfort. While Lawson struggled to keep himself from shouting in the middle of the crowd, the phone in the young customer's hand was still recording. He knew what was coming might be beyond anyone's imagination, and Marjorie knew that just one more word from Lawson would send everything spinning out of control. The air in the diner hung in suspense, everyone waiting to see which explosion would come first. The next insult, or the moment action, crossed the line. They could all feel it getting dangerously close, and Lawson was the one about to light the match. The light in the diner shifted as Lawson stepped in closer, his shadow cutting across Marjorie's face like a block of darkness, swallowing the woman still holding her receipt. The entire diner fell silent. The only sound was the faint clink of cutlery hitting tabletops, and then stopping, like everyone could feel a storm rolling in. Lawson took a deep breath, his lip curling into a sour grin, then suddenly grabbed Marjorie's wrist, his grip so forceful her shoulder jerked back. He twisted her arm down as if apprehending a pickpocket, his voice low and sharp, each word strained through his teeth. "Don't play games. Stay still for an ID check." The arrogance in his voice made a few nearby diners turn away, but they still peeked from the corners of their eyes. Their expressions read like they were watching a scene they'd already decided. She must have done something. Instead of asking why a police officer was manhandling a well-dressed woman paying her bill, Marjorie leaned with the pull, her face composed, though the veins in her twisted hand bulged. The cashier behind the counter had gone pale, eyes darting between them, frozen in place. A white elderly woman near the door, her silver hair neatly cut short, placed a hand on her chair as she tried to rise. Her voice trembled with age, but her intent was clear. She didn't get to finish. Lawson snapped his head around, eyes wide, and barked. "Not your business?" His words dropped like stone, slamming into the oldest person in the room, stopping her cold. She sank back into her seat as if someone had pushed her down. Her husband, seated beside her, gently touched her shoulder, a silent warning not to interfere. He knew speaking up to a cop was the fastest way to get in trouble. Lawson turned back to Marjorie, his grip still locked tight on her wrist, squeezing harder, his face close enough to see if she would flinch. He pulled out his gun and pointed it at her face. "Hands up! Let me see what you're hiding," he said. The words stirred a quiet ripple through the room. No one really believed the woman standing there paying her bill was a threat, but no one spoke up either. Everyone had seen too many stories end badly after someone talked back to the police. Marjorie let out a short breath, just enough to hold her balance. Her voice was low but steady. "I already told you, I'm just paying." She said it like she was pushing pain down with every word, but still refused to lower her head. That defiance only made Lawson angrier. He took it as a challenge, and for someone like him, a challenge meant disrespect. A man in a suit at the next table leaned in and said quietly to his friend, "I'm guessing she did something. Cops don't just act up for no reason." That sentence changed the mood again. It was like everyone in the room needed an excuse for their silence. If Lawson was right, then keeping quiet wasn't cowardice anymore. Another middle-aged woman even shook her head and whispered, "She looks stubborn." Each whisper became another bolt on the door, shutting down any chance that someone might step in. As Lawson holstered his weapon and yanked Marjorie's arm higher, a young diner near the exit placed his phone on the table and adjusted it, pretending to check the menu, though the camera was aimed straight at Lawson and Marjorie. His hand trembled, not because he feared being caught, but because he knew how quickly this could escalate. He'd seen too many videos like this. They rarely ended well. Others in the diner began to notice he was recording, but pretended not to see. They knew a video could be the only proof against a police report, but it could also drag them into a mess. Lawson tilted his head slightly, like he was about to yank her arm up one notch higher. "You gonna follow orders, or want cuffs right here?" The room tightened like a rope being pulled taut. Everyone held their breath, eyes locked on the two of them. Marjorie absorbed the force, her shoulder dipping slightly, but her eyes stayed locked forward. Her expression wasn't fear. It was the endurance of someone too familiar with this kind of treatment. The young man filming swallowed hard. He had seen Lawson glance toward the camera for just a second, like he'd caught the shift of movement. Marjorie noticed the tension in the kid's eyes, and she knew he was trying to do the right thing. The one thing no one else in that room dared. In that moment, Lawson tightened his grip, pulling Marjorie sharply toward him. The receipt slipped from her hand, drifting gently to a corner of the floor. A young couple at the corner table also looked over, but the wife grabbed her husband's arm, as if warning him not to get involved. All those small actions hit Marjorie in the most unsettling way, because she understood that no one in the room truly believed she was innocent. They simply thought she deserved to be questioned, deserved to be suspected because her skin color told them so. Before Lawson could say another word, the young customer recording hit the button to start filming officially. The screen lit up, capturing Lawson's clenched face and Marjorie's still calm eyes in the same frame. No one in that room knew this was the exact moment that would trigger a chain reaction, one that no one could control once it spread beyond the diner's glass windows. Lawson glanced briefly at the kid holding the phone, then yanked Marjorie's arm hard, dragging her out of the diner like she was an unwanted item. A few people stood up but quickly sat back down, pretending to continue their lunch. No one wanted to get involved with the police. Out on the sidewalk, the sound of the cuffs snapping around her wrists rang louder than the traffic. The patrol car was already parked in front, its back door open like a block of ice. Marjorie stepped in without a word, keeping her eyes forward. As the car pulled away, the small diner faded into the distance, while everything that was about to happen came rushing forward fast. The hallway of the North Atlanta precinct was always cold like a lab room. The smell of disinfectant mixing with the static hiss of the duty room radio made the chill even sharper. A gust of air swept through as the door behind Lawson opened. He shoved Marjorie ahead of him, gripping her tightly like she was a suspect fresh from a crime scene, even though her steps remained calm and steady. A few officers lining the corridor glanced up. Some recognized Lawson, others straightened as soon as they saw the cuffs on Marjorie's wrists. They had seen this scene too many times, so often they no longer asked why. They just assumed the one in cuffs must be the one in the wrong. The cold fluorescent lights washed over her face, draining the color from it. But her eyes stayed sharp, steady, unbowed. At the end of the hallway, the intake desk was waiting. A young officer named Clyde was entering data from another case when Lawson pushed the door open roughly and lowered his voice a notch, the way men do when they're asserting dominance. "Got one for processing." Clyde looked up, ready to reply by the book, but his eyes landed on Marjorie's face and froze for half a second. He brought the scanner to her wrist. A soft beep sounded. The screen lit up with her information, and immediately his brows furrowed. "Marjorie Hale," Clyde read aloud, then looked deeper into the job title, where the text was unmistakable. His lips moved as if talking to himself. "Marjorie Hale. Wait, is that her?" An older officer nearby scowled and shook his head, a quiet warning not to continue, but Clyde's reaction had already drawn attention. The atmosphere shifted at that exact moment. Clyde swallowed hard and turned to Lawson, voice lowered. "Officer Lawson, there's a problem." Lawson shrugged, his face annoyed. "What problem? Just process her." Clyde took a breath, trying to keep his voice even. "Her name matches someone with a position." Lawson's eyes widened. "I arrested her for resisting. I don't care who she is." The other officers behind them glanced at one another. No one said a word, but their expressions made it clear this couldn't be handled like just another routine case. Clyde opened the report Lawson had submitted. He barely skimmed a few lines before closing the file. It burned. He glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed. One nearby officer spun his chair in the opposite direction, casually but deliberately removing himself from the situation. The duty supervisor stepped out of the back room, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Seeing Clyde frozen still, he asked, "What's going on? You look like a statue." Clyde handed him the report. The man gave it a quick look, his expression shifting from irritated to tense in a blink. He bent over, reread it carefully, then folded the file right in front of Lawson. His tone changed completely. "Under further review." Lawson frowned. "Why's it being held up?" "I followed protocol." The supervisor placed the file on the desk and slapped a label on the corner of the screen. A bold red word appeared. "Pending." He lowered his voice, making sure those farther away wouldn't hear. "Don't let the press see this report. Do not upload it to the public system, I think." Marjorie watched it all unfold like a play she'd seen too many times before. She stood still, letting them handle one another, because she knew silence in that moment carried more weight than any outburst. She had witnessed this kind of unraveling in civil rights cases, the kind of sudden quiet that only came from one of two things: deep fear, or the realization that the person standing in front of them was not ordinary. She didn't speak. She didn't look at Lawson again. Her eyes stayed on the two officers whispering behind the intake desk. Another officer passed by, about to ask what was going on, but when he saw the red pending tag, he said nothing and walked back into the room, quietly closing the door behind him. That act felt like someone pulling down a curtain, a clear signal that this situation couldn't go through the usual system. Silence spread down the hallway, thin, but cold like a layer of ice starting to form from a single point. The room was so quiet you could hear the duty officer's pen tapping against the desk. He stood up, adjusted his shirt buttons, then leaned down and whispered to Clyde, in a tone that sounded like an order. "The chief said leave it there. Deal with it tomorrow." The young officer glanced around, slightly panicked, because he knew exactly what that meant. It meant the whole precinct would pretend tonight never happened. It meant they would let things sit for now while figuring out a way to smooth it over. It meant they would work to lessen Lawson's fault before the press got wind of it. Lawson heard that clearly. His face relaxed a little, as he had just gotten confirmation that the system still had his back. He looked at Marjorie with the smug confidence of someone who believed that if he did something wrong, someone would cover for him. She met his gaze with calm eyes, unflinching, unchanged, creating a tension that made both Lawson and the officers in the room uneasy. Every eye turned toward the bright red pending sign on the screen, like a placeholder marking the moment a reckless arrest was being pushed into the shadows, getting ready to be reshaped into a cleaner file. Out in the hallway, another young officer walked by, caught a bit of the phrase, "Deal with it tomorrow," and frowned, but kept walking quickly, as if afraid he might get pulled back. A feeling of unease swept through the building, as if everyone understood this wouldn't stay quiet for long. The arrest had shifted from a diner incident to something much heavier, and each person in the precinct chose to stay silent at the right time to avoid being dragged into it. Only one person understood that this silence was the sound of an alarm bell, and that was Marjorie, the one who knew that when the system starts covering up, that's when the truth needs to be exposed the most. The APD conference room sat on the third floor, sealed like a steel box. Pale yellow lights reflected off the faces of senior officers gathered around the long table. No one said what they were really thinking. Everyone kept their eyes on the files in front of them, instead of looking at each other, because they all understood this was no longer just a simple mistaken arrest. The division chief opened the meeting with a flat sentence. "We have a public image problem," and that line immediately steered the entire meeting away from the real issue. No one mentioned that Lawson had twisted the arm of a woman simply trying to pay her bill. No one said the name Marjorie Hale aloud, even though it carried enough weight to make the whole room tread carefully. The discussion circled only around the video recorded in the diner, how it had started spreading, how journalists were already emailing questions, how the public had begun to murmur. An older officer spoke up, voice low but clear. "If that video's not blocked in 24 hours, we're going to be under serious pressure," and then quickly looked down, as if saying more would mark him as being on the wrong side. The media liaison laid down a stack of papers, breaking down the clip's viral spread, and emphasized the response needed to be safe, avoiding any statement that clearly claimed Lawson was right or wrong. The division chief asked a short question. "Do we need to suspend Lawson?" And the room immediately sank into a thin layer of silence. Everyone knew that suspending him would mean acknowledging the seriousness of the situation and admitting that meant lighting a match under a system that had been rotten for years. Finally, the deputy chief spun a pen between his fingers and said coldly, "Paid administrative leave. Temporary." That line let a few people in the room breathe easier, as they'd just dodged a direct hit to the department's core. Another person chimed in, "We say it's under internal review, and keep the report in pending status for a few days." No one objected. No one showed concern. Everyone moved according to instinct, the same instinct that had long kept the system busy covering for itself. The decision was locked in within minutes, so fast it was as if no one had even weighed the consequences. Lawson had been leaning against the wall since the start of the meeting, listening to every word with a face full of impatience. When the deputy chief made it official that he would be placed on administrative leave, Lawson didn't flinch. His lip curled slightly, arms crossed over his chest. He looked around the room, eyes full of smug satisfaction. The look of someone who knew exactly how protected he was. "Told you," Lawson said slowly, heavily. "This system knows who it protects, Inside. No one replied, but a few faces flickered with discomfort, like the words had hit too close to a truth they were all trying to bury. In the corner, a younger officer stood with arms folded, a rare frown darkening his face, but he turned away. Because here, speaking out meant stepping into the fire. The division chief cleared his throat to close the meeting, reminded the comms team to stick with the under review line, and told the records team to halt all uploads to the public system for 48 hours. Someone else noted that legal should prepare a press statement in case the media pressure grew. Everything revolved around damage control. Not a single word touched on Lawson's actual accountability. They left the room one by one, closing the heavy door behind them like sealing a vault full of secrets. The hallway outside was quiet, footsteps heavy, and through the weight of it all, Lawson's words still echoed in every head like a thorn that wouldn't come loose. He was the last to walk out, hands shoved into his pockets, with the posture of a man who knew the road had been cleared for him by the very system he served. He had nothing to worry about because he believed everything, just like this time, would always be handled the same way APD had handled things for years. The clip from the diner was posted online just minutes after Lawson left the conference room, and before nightfall, all of Atlanta was on fire. Social media, community groups, neighborhood forums, and local news sites everywhere showed the same image. Brent Lawson's flushed face and his hand twisting Marjorie Hale's wrist in the middle of a high-end breakfast spot in Buckhead. The caption added by the uploader read, "An elderly woman arrested by police while paying her bill. This is Buckhead, not the projects." The line was sharp enough to make people stop scrolling and short enough to spread like wildfire. The comments beneath the video climbed by the second. Black residents across Atlanta left angry messages, many saying they had experienced similar situations dozens of times, the only difference being that they hadn't been lucky enough to have someone recording. A man in West End wrote that he was once ordered to lie face down on a sidewalk because the officer said he looked like someone who needed checking. A woman shared how she'd taught her son never to stand too close to the checkout counter at the grocery store, to avoid the familiar suspicious looks. These stories poured in like a flood. No clickbait, no exaggeration, because anyone who'd lived in Atlanta long enough knew this kind of quiet discrimination wasn't rare. Decent white residents also joined the comments. Many were shocked that something like this could happen in a wealthy neighborhood like Buckhead, a place they believed was under control. One middle-aged man said he'd eaten lunch at that diner for 3 years and had never seen anyone treated that way. An older woman questioned why Lawson didn't say anything before grabbing someone's wrist. They weren't defending him, they were stunned. The kind of stunned that comes from realizing something awful just happened right in front of your house. Small news outlets began clipping the video and publishing articles within the hour. Headlines started appearing in unison. Controversial arrest in Buckhead. Police criticized for excessive force on elderly woman. Question raised. Is this about race? The rate of shares grew so fast that reporters from major news networks had no choice but to take notice. They contacted APD the same night, demanding explanations, requesting the report, and asking about the woman's condition. APD responded by email, in a message so brief it felt like evasion. "We are still investigating." That statement only fueled the fire because it signaled a delay tactic, something the public had seen before and remembered all too well. Members of the black community began organizing a gathering outside the diner. Some held signs demanding an independent investigation. Others wanted to know Marjorie Hale's condition. The diner manager had to close early. Staff inside said they'd received more than 10 anonymous calls within 2 hours. Some yelling, some asking if the diner was connected to the police. More and more people showed up in the area, forming small groups around the parking lot, talking, shaking their heads, watching the clip frame by frame on their phones. They could clearly see Lawson's hand clenching her wrist so tightly that the skin stretched. They could see how he shoved her shoulder, forcing her body off balance. Those details no longer left room for questions. Anyone who saw it understood this was not standard procedure. At the same time, APD's communications team was called into an emergency meeting. They were caught off guard by how fast the video spread. One staffer offered a standard, templated response, but leadership said it sounded too cold, too dismissive. In the end, they agreed to stick to a single line. "We are still investigating," even though they knew it would only make people angrier. A reporter from a major news channel sent another email asking for Lawson's current whereabouts. APD dodged the question, saying they couldn't provide the information due to internal safety concerns. That only deepened the public's suspicion that Lawson was being protected. While public attention was still locked on the first video, an anonymous account on a video-sharing platform suddenly posted a second clip. This one was filmed from the left corner table of the diner lower angle, closer, showing Lawson's face more clearly than the first. The account used no real name, left no comment, just uploaded the clip with a short caption. "Another angle. Watch for yourself." The video captured the moment Lawson twisted Marjorie's wrist so forcefully that her body tilted sideways, and his voice was caught more clearly in the frame. "Let me see what you're hiding on you." That sentence became the second spark, spreading faster and hitting harder than the first video. Just minutes after the second clip appeared, legal experts, social activists, and civil rights attorneys began weighing in. One wrote that Lawson's arm-pulling technique was a move used when subduing a resisting suspect, and completely inappropriate for someone simply standing to pay a bill. A former officer noted the move could easily injure the shoulder of an older person. These analyses amplified the outrage, because they confirmed that what people had seen wasn't routine procedure, it was excessive force. The story began spreading beyond Atlanta, rising to trending status across the entire state of Georgia. Some people started asking whether the APD had covered up similar incidents before. Many comments recalled past abuse of power cases that had been exposed but then faded with time. A phrase began circulating widely online. "This video isn't a surprise. It's proof of something that's been happening far too long." People kept talking from evening to almost midnight, the mood a mix of anger and disappointment, underlined by one big question. Why is the APD dodging accountability if Lawson did nothing wrong? At the bottom of the newsfeed, the second video kept spreading like wildfire. Within hours, it was no longer just a clip from a diner. It had become a symbol of the kind of treatment Black Atlantans knew all too well. And as viewers realized there were two different camera angles, they knew this story wouldn't be buried as easily as the ones before. One account commented, "If this is happening in Buckhead, imagine what it's like in poorer neighborhoods." That line drew hundreds of replies beneath it. In the middle of the storm, only one person stayed completely silent. The woman who appeared in both clips, who said nothing while being dragged and twisted, the woman old enough to understand exactly what kind of silence matters. Marjorie Hale had not spoken to the press, had not posted online, but her name was everywhere from news reports to conversations. People knew she was the victim in the video, but no one yet realized that her story went deeper, longer, and weighed heavier than what they were seeing. And with the second video's release, a new question started surfacing, one that no one at the APD wanted to face. The video had spread across the internet like a flood, and the pressure from the community grew so intense that APD could no longer justify holding Marjorie. A captain came to the holding cell near the end of the afternoon, tapped lightly on the bars, and unlocked the door. He avoided eye contact, speaking in a flat tone like reading from a script. "Miss Hale, you're being released. The case file is under review." There was no apology, no explanation. Marjorie stepped out. The metal door clanged shut behind her with a cold, dry thud. Her lawyer was waiting at the end of the hallway, handed her a coat, and helped guide her out of the precinct. No one inside dared say a word. On the steps outside, Marjorie took a long breath, paused for a few seconds, and said to her lawyer, "File the paperwork. I want this handled through legal channels. Is the giveness?" The Fulton County Legal Office was housed in an old red brick building with a quiet exterior. But the front steps felt like a bus stop at rush hour. 12 reporters stood in a row, some holding microphones, some live streaming, others raising phones just to capture the moment Marjorie Hale appeared. They swarmed her the instant she stepped out of the dark sedan her lawyer was driving. Flashbulbs popped. Voices called out her name over and over. "Miss Hale, do you have a statement? Do you think the police targeted you on purpose? Have you seen the 2 viral clips?" Marjorie walked straight ahead, at a steady pace. Her gaze steady, neither dodging nor engaging. Her path felt like a tightrope stretched between 2 extremes. Outside was public outrage. Inside was the decision she had weighed all night. Her lawyer walked beside her, shielding her slightly from the cameras, opening the door so she could enter. The cold wind stopped at the door. Inside, the air changed to the smell of paper, ink, and the steady whir of photocopiers. A young staffer directed her to the civil complaint office, where people filed and signed formal grievances. A thick folder was already placed on the table, each page marked for signature. She sat down without removing her orange blazer, face unchanged, uncapped her pen, and began reading. Reporters outside still tried to aim their cameras through the window. But the security guard shook his head and pulled the blinds halfway down. Her lawyer whispered, "You don't need to talk to the press right now." Marjorie gave a small nod. The first page of the complaint clearly stated the incident, but the section where she was asked to sign wasn't the part about her arrest. It was the demand for a full investigation into the conduct of Officer Brent Lawson. Her handwriting was steady, her pen strokes firm and precise. The complaint ran 5 pages, each requiring her signature. She signed them all, one by one. The clerk handling the file glanced at her name, then over at her lawyer, his expression shifting to one of surprised caution. He had probably read the news. He knew who she was, or at least sensed this wasn't just another routine complaint like the ones they usually processed. Marjorie didn't speak much. She asked only a few questions about what came next, her voice low and direct. "How long until APD is required to respond?" The clerk replied quietly, 14 days by policy, but with this case, it might be sooner." She signed the final page, pushed the folder back across the table, and her lawyer confirmed it. Then both stood to leave. Before walking out, Marjorie looked at the complaint one last time, as if committing it to memory, this thing she had just set into motion, something that could reach into parts of the system long buried beneath stacks of reports no one wanted to open. The file was sent straight to the Civil Rights Data Processing Room, where massive steel cabinets held records of cases spanning over 20 years. The technician scanned Marjorie's case code, and the screen flashed a red alert, requiring access to the archived vault. That section was rarely touched, filled with files previously shelved due to lack of evidence or no further investigation necessary. But Marjorie's complaint, because of her identity and legal weight, forced APD to pull those drawers open even if they didn't want to. In the data room, an old fan hummed steadily as the technician scanned through the list. Suddenly, an error message appeared, requesting access to a technically sealed data vault. He hesitated, glanced around to see if anyone was watching, then entered an override code to unlock the section labeled Sensitive. The screen stayed black for quite a while, before folders began appearing slowly, one by one. He scrolled down and saw years marked with special tags, many of them containing files related to elderly black individuals who had been flagged for suspicion. The technician swallowed hard, then muttered to himself, "Should have stayed closed." He wasn't talking to anyone, just to himself, as if old memories from past cases were flooding back. Some of the files buried here had once stirred controversy, and pulling them up again would mean answering questions the entire APD had worked hard to avoid. But the order to open the vault had come directly from the legal office, so he had no choice. He looked at the newest files submitted and saw Marjorie Hale's name printed clearly in the corner. And he knew this one wouldn't be buried again like the others. Just as he began the backup sequence, outside, Marjorie and her lawyer stepped out of the hallway and paused at the main entrance, where the crowd of reporters still stood as thick as when she arrived. One shouted, "Mrs. Hale, do you want an apology from APD?" Another pushed in, "Do you believe Lawson was protected because of his skin color?" The questions flew at her one after another. Marjorie looked straight toward the exit, gave no response, and stepped down the front steps slowly, leaving the building with the calm stride of someone who knew she had just laid the first stone to drag an entire system into the light. As she walked away, everything inside the APD data room began shifting. Old, sealed drawers started to creak open. Each folder that appeared on screen was like a layer of dust blown off the system. And every document uploaded was a warning that long-standing silence was about to be broken. She didn't need to be there to see it. She knew too well that when a heavy door opens, its echo always finds those who need to hear it. Outside, the sky grew darker. But her story was only just beginning. The sky fell quickly after the complaint was filed. The law office sank into a dim yellow glow from an old hallway lamp, while the wind outside swept through the yard in long gusts, rattling the glass door. Marjorie sat in a small conference room, her hand resting on a stack of documents the lawyer had returned for her to review one last time before they were submitted the next morning. No one spoke much. Both she and the lawyer were worn down after a long day surrounded by press, social media noise, and endless public chatter. It was in moments of silence like this that she could fully feel the weight of what she had set in motion. As she stood to leave, a soft noise came from outside the door. Something small sliding across the floor. The lawyer stepped out to check, then returned, looking mildly surprised. Under the door was an ivory-colored business card. No flashy logo, just a name printed in small type and a handwritten line scrawled along the left edge. Marjorie picked it up, her fingers pausing when she read the messy handwriting. "Please call me. I know what APD is hiding." The last three words, "is hiding," were written in darker ink, as if the writer had pressed harder, out of fear or resolve. There was no office number, only a single mobile number with an unclear area code. The lawyer looked at her, concern written plainly on his face. Anyone reaching out like this wasn't someone who wanted to be seen. Marjorie held the card for a few seconds longer, then slipped it into her pocket without a word. They locked up and stepped out into the cold wind. She didn't get into the car until the street was mostly empty. Once home, she sat in the armchair by the window, turned on a desk lamp, and laid the card on the glass surface, studying every letter. She looked up at the ceiling, paused, then picked up the phone and dialed the number. The call was answered after 3 rings by a young man's voice, low, slightly shaky, starting with a sentence that sounded like a cross between a greeting and a warning. "This is Aaron Pierce." Marjorie didn't waste time. "You left a card at the law office. What do you want to say?" There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, long enough to hear him breathing heavily, trying to steady it. "I work in internal affairs," Aaron said. "And I can't let them rewrite the report again." Marjorie leaned back in her chair. Her voice was steady. "Rewrite which report?" Aaron inhaled deeply, choosing his words carefully. "Your arrest report. They're editing it, removing details, downplaying the severity. Same thing they've done before. His voice lowered toward the end, as if someone might be listening in. Marjorie stared out the window. The street was quiet, lit only by a street lamp's yellow glow. "Why are you contacting me?" she asked. Aaron's voice trembled more now. "Because I've watched them do this for years. And I don't want to be part of it anymore." And that sentence struck her gut. She recognized the voice of someone standing right on the edge, caught between fear and the urge to tell the truth. "Do you know what they changed in the report?" she asked. Aaron opened a file on his end. She could hear the soft clicking of keys. Then he replied, "They removed the part where Officer Lawson slammed your hand on the counter. Removed the line about the body search comment. They wrote that you resisted arrest." Marjorie stared at the card, her eyes unusually sharp and clear. "Are you sure?" she asked. Aaron answered without hesitation, "There's a log. I can see it. But they'll erase it tonight." Marjorie closed her eyes for a few seconds, then said, "Send me the log." On the other end, Aaron hesitated, trapped between fear and responsibility. There was a short silence before he said, "Okay, but you can't say who gave it to you. I'll lose my job." "I understand," Marjorie replied. No promises were made, but her voice alone was enough to assure him she was not someone who exposed her sources. The phone shut off, and less than a minute later, an email arrived. The attached file was only a few hundred kilobytes, but it landed with the weight of a stone. Marjorie opened it and saw lines of system logs showing edit times, user access, and deleted entries. Lawson's name appeared 4 times in an old complaint list, each marked excessive force while on duty. But what made her pause wasn't the content. It was the phrase behind each record, "File missing." Strangely, all 4 files disappeared at nearly identical times, under the hands of certain individuals' names she recognized from past civil rights hearings. That pattern was no longer a coincidence. A follow-up message from Aaron came shortly after. "This is just what I could find. The rest might be locked." Marjorie sat silently for a long time, the desk lamp casting a glow across her face, half in light, half in shadow, as if mirroring the 2 halves of the story, the part she had lived through and the part about to unfold. She thought of all the times she had seen reports like this from a different role, in different buildings, where numbers were bent to avoid hard questions. This time, she wasn't the one reviewing the documents. She was the one in them, the person being dragged into a truth someone had tried to bury. A strong gust of wind swept past the window, rustling the curtain slightly, but the room remained still. Marjorie placed the business card on the table, lining it up neatly, as if that small object was the first piece of a larger puzzle now thrown into chaos. She slid all the documents into a hard folder, locked it, then turned off the light. That night, she knew someone inside the APD had decided to break the silence, and that always meant 2 things. First, the truth had reached a point where it could no longer be contained, and second, the person who spoke up might have to pay the price. She climbed the stairs with slow, steady steps, fully aware that this night was not the end of the trouble, but the moment the door opened to the darkest part of the story. The parking lot behind the law office was as empty as the backyard of an abandoned building. A yellow light flickered on a pole, swaying slightly in the wind, casting shadows over oil-stained pavement. Marjorie's lawyer stood beside the sedan, arms crossed, eyes scanning every direction, like someone used to these kinds of quiet meetings. Aaron Pierce arrived a few minutes late. His old car was parked farther away than usual, 3 empty spaces between it and the others, an effort to keep his license plate out of anyone's frame. He stepped out, hood pulled low, worry etched across his face. As he approached, he said softly, "I can't meet inside the office. They monitor internal access all day. The lawyer nodded and opened the back door so both could sit inside the sedan. The cabin was dimmer, the smell of leather mixed with cold air from an old air conditioner. Aaron glanced around once more before pulling a brown envelope from his coat. He rested it on his lap, as if still debating whether or not to hand it over. The lawyer watched him, waiting. Finally, Aaron exhaled a long breath and said, "They have a quota." The words dropped into the silence of the car, like a stone. The lawyer asked quietly, "What kind of quota?" Aaron opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets, each printed with charts and zip code markers. He placed them into the lawyer's hands and spoke clearly, word by word. Arrest quotas by zip code. Focused on 30305, 30311, 30318. Elderly black people are the first targets. The lawyer read the first line, and his expression changed. These numbers weren't something you could just ignore. Several columns labeled the rate of random checks, but it was the red line at the bottom of the page that made him stiffen. Aaron leaned in and pointed at the most jarring section. 81% of individuals stopped during random sweeps are black and over 50. His voice was soft, but every word hit hard. 81, the lawyer repeated, needing to be sure he'd read it right. The numbers needed no further explanation. They spelled out exactly who the targets were. Those zip codes weren't random either. They were all areas with dense black populations in Atlanta. The wind rustled through the trees outside. A few dry leaves tumbled across the pavement, brushing against the car's tires. The two men sat in silence for a few seconds, long enough to feel the weight of what they were holding. Aaron tugged at the hem of his coat and continued. They use the word random in the reports, but there's nothing random about it. There's even a quarterly adjustment chart. If they don't hit the numbers for a quarter, they shift officers into this zone or that one to increase community oversight. Sounds nice, but it's targeting. Plain and simple. The lawyer flipped to the next page and saw a code labeled NTI Priority. The list below had several names crossed out and others bolded. At the bottom of the page, in tiny font near the edge, was a red circled line. He read it under his breath. NTI Priority, Hail Senior Access. To Provet. Aaron stared at the floor, avoiding the lawyer's eyes, then said with a shallow breath, "That line's not a typo." They tagged her family. The lawyer slapped the paper down onto the seat, his look shifting from surprise to anger. "You're saying the system has already been tracking or targeting her family?" Aaron nodded. "I've seen this flag in a few old files cases where older black individuals were pulled over without cause, but those notations usually got scrubbed. This one just hadn't been wiped yet." He lowered his voice. "I don't think they ever intended anyone to see that line." The lawyer leaned back in his seat, calculating. "They use the NTI label for internal target groups. Priority means it's ranked with urgency." Aaron added, "Hail, Senior Access, most likely refers to her father. Just reading it makes that clear. I believe the system flagged that family's file as part of some kind of surveillance program." Those words made the air inside the car feel even heavier. As if all three people understood this was no longer just a case of isolated police misconduct, but part of a deliberate network of targeted profiling. The lawyer opened his bag, filed the papers into a hard folder, then looked straight at Aaron. "You do know this puts you at risk." Aaron let out a dry, unsteady breath. "I know. But I've watched Lawson walk free 4 times. I've seen files get deleted. I've seen how they dodge accountability. I don't want to be part of that cover-up again." He rested his hand on his thigh, fingers slightly trembling. "I sent those documents because I don't want them to disappear like the others." The meeting lasted about 15 minutes. No one raised their voice. No one panicked. But the air in the car grew colder, with each piece of truth laid out. When Aaron stood up, his hand gripped the door handle like he was gathering every ounce of courage to leave. His final words were, "Don't use any public number to reach me. I'll call when I have more." Then he stepped back from the car and moved quickly toward his old sedan, never once looking back. Each of his footsteps echoed like a long, slow warning. The lawyer stayed seated for a few more seconds after Aaron left. He looked down at the folder, tapping a finger lightly on the corner of the envelope. The phrase, "Hale Senior Access," stood out in the margin like a reminder that this case had gone far beyond one hot-headed cop in a diner. As he drove out of the parking lot, the Atlanta sky had turned a purplish gray, the kind of color that always came before a major storm rolled in. And this time, he knew for certain the storm wouldn't just break over the APD. It would hit every place that had ever believed the truth could stay buried inside old data vaults. The APD data room was buried deep in the basement, lit by rows of tired neon lights overhead that cast a dull, pale glow on the tightly packed filing cabinets. The technician had unlocked the old archive vault as requested by the legal office, but when the list appeared on screen, he felt a wave of unease. Some of the names, he thought, had long disappeared from the system. One folder with a faded label showed up near the center of the screen, its text so faint he had to squint to read it. "Hale, Samuel." He clicked it. The file opened with a simple layout, just a few lines of text, a few scene photos, and some scattered notes. But one detail made him straighten up like he'd uncovered a buried map. Case processed, 1994. Status, technically sealed. At that moment, the door swung open, and Marjorie's lawyer entered, followed by an appointed compliance officer assigned to ensure the process was handled legally. The technician pulled his chair closer to the screen, his voice slightly hoarse as he stared at the data. "I should warn you, this file is old. Very old. It was reclassified during the system migration." The lawyer nodded, signaling him to proceed. The first image to appear was a name card, handwriting from the pre-printer era, clearly written, "Samuel Hale." Beneath the name was a cause of death note, the ink faded, but still legible. "Cause of death, resisting arrest." The lawyer frowned. He had seen too many cases closed with that same vague phrase, a line used to end stories no one wanted questioned. But when the technician opened the crime scene photos, the entire room sank into a heavy silence. A black-and-white photograph, clearly taken with film from that era, showed a man lying on the ground near an old residential neighborhood. His eyes were nearly shut, dried blood at his temple. The position of his body and the camera angle didn't suggest a struggle, it looked like a blow to the head. The lawyer leaned closer, comparing it with the event description. "Doesn't match," he said softly, but loud enough for the technician to hear. The case note claimed Samuel had attacked the officer and was subdued, but the blood trail and body posture suggested he was struck from behind, with no signs of a scuffle. The lawyer flipped to the next page and found a slip of pale yellow paper tucked between the documents, the kind used decades ago. At the top, in red ink, was a handwritten warning: "Do not open without state-level clearance." The handwriting was bold, clean, like a field officer's note. The lawyer handed the slip to the technician, who swallowed hard. "I've never seen a note like this. Regular files don't have these. This is a high seal tag." He flipped it over, where a signature had been blacked out with thick ink. That alone made the lawyer more certain someone had intentionally hidden the original details. The technician continued and opened the final section. A roster of those on duty during the incident. 2 names had been blurred out, but the third remained fully visible: Sergeant William Carr. The lawyer skimmed through Carr's personnel files, eyes narrowing as he reached the final line. Precinct, North Atlanta. To Averett. The compliance officer standing behind him whispered, "That's Lawson's precinct." The sentence was quiet, but it hit like a dropped weight. The lawyer turned back to the screen, calculating. So the officer involved in Hale's father's case and Lawson came from the same place. The air in the room shifted. The basement suddenly felt colder. These weren't just fragments of data anymore. They were forming the shape of something larger, something that had been hidden for nearly 3 decades. The technician scrolled to the bottom of the file and found a section labeled Supplemental Notes, but it was set to read only. The metadata showed signs of multiple edits. He opened the revision history. A series of changes appeared, entries from the years 1999, 2003, 2008. Then nothing for years, until a recent system upgrade. All the edits had been accessed by senior officers, but every identity was encrypted. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, hand resting on his forehead. They don't want anyone touching this file. The supervisor crossed his arms and let out a sigh. Someone buried this case at the bottom of a drawer for nearly 30 years. But when he looked again at the scene photo, the details in the image made him pause. If Samuel's death wasn't for resisting orders, then what was it? Why? The lawyer answered slowly. Beaten during a routine ID check. That's the most likely. He looked at the redacted portion of the report where the officer's testimony should have been. They took the statement, then deleted it, he said. The technician pulled up the system log. A stream of code ran down the screen, and he pointed to a specific entry. This line shows the file was relabeled. It was originally tagged as Homicide Inquiry, later changed to Officer Resisted Incident. The lawyer's eyes widened. They falsified the classification. The technician nodded and altered the cause of death. The anger in his voice came through, despite his effort to hold it back. No one's touched this file in over 20 years. That means the person responsible either retired or wanted it buried. The deeper they dug, the more they saw how the system had reshaped files the same way they were now trying to handle Marjorie's case. The lawyer began cross-referencing the timeline of Samuel Hale's death with the period when officers at the North Atlanta precinct were accused of misconduct. The overlaps were too frequent to ignore. He looked closely at the name Sergeant William Carr, then spoke quietly, as if fitting in the final piece of the puzzle. Carr was named in a civil rights complaint in the late 90s. But that case vanished too. The technician added one more line that dropped like a weight across the room. Carr was the training officer that year. Lawson joined the force a few years later. That sentence made the lawyer lean fully onto the table, as if the two names separated by decades had just been drawn together into a single line. A line leading from her father's death to the officer who twisted her arm in the diner. No longer a string of coincidences, but a pattern. A legacy passed from one generation to the next, within the same precinct. As they closed the file, the black and white photo of Samuel Hale still lingered in the corner of the screen, his eyes shut, as if waiting for someone to finally unlock a door that had stayed sealed for 29 years. The lawyer looked at the screen before leaving the room and said softly, "She needs to see this." The technician remained still for a long moment, knowing that the truth buried in this basement had enough force to blow open everything the APD had tried to keep hidden for 3 decades. The town hall meeting was held in a small church on the west side of Atlanta, the kind of place where the community gathered when something big happened and people felt like they had nowhere else to be heard. The wooden pews were packed, people standing shoulder to shoulder out the door. The air in the room felt heavy, like rain was coming, and every face was tense from what they had seen over the past 2 days, ever since Marjorie's video went viral. An elderly woman with a cane stood up first. Her voice trembled but was clear. "I got pulled over 3 times in 1 week. I was wearing my work uniform, had my employee badge, and they still asked if I'd stolen anything." The room murmured, not in surprise, but in recognition. The story was too familiar. An older man in the front row raised his hand and stepped into the aisle. He looked around the room and said, "They called me boy at the age of 60. Boy, clear as day. I told them to show a little respect for my age, and they laughed and said if I didn't like it, I could take them to court." As more people began to share their own stories, the atmosphere in the church shifted into a steady current of testimony, person after person, describing how they were pulled over for no reason, how women had their bags searched without cause, how elderly men were forced to face the wall for matching a description, how young men were spat on when they asked why they were being searched. A middle-aged woman said her son was dragged out of his car just for forgetting to turn on his headlights. They said he looked suspicious. That's all it took. Someone behind her added that he had been punched for asking why he was being fined. And from the third row, another voice said, they once cried on their front porch after an officer yelled that this neighborhood wasn't meant for people like you. The local station had sent a young reporter named Maya to cover the meeting. She sat by the wall, taking notes. Since the Marjorie video surfaced, Maya had been following the story more closely than anyone in her newsroom because she knew this wasn't just about one woman being mistreated. It was the spring, snapping loose after years of being wound too tight. Maya looked up across the room, her face serious but bright, the expression of someone piecing together fragments into a larger truth. She spoke with people one by one, asking for exact times, officer names, the specific words they remembered. And as the accounts came together, something began to chill her. Many people described nearly identical phrases, tones, even the way officers stood. Maya circled every repetition, then moved toward a group sitting near the back. A thin man, around 45 years old, stood and shared that he was pulled over at 7 in the evening in the 30318 area, supposedly for irregular movement, though he was driving at the correct speed. I asked why, he said, his voice even, and the officer leaned into my window and said something I'll never forget. The rules don't apply to people like you. The room went quiet for several seconds, not because the phrase was new, but because it was so painfully familiar. Two women near the back looked up almost simultaneously. Maya moved closer and asked directly, "Are those his exact words?" The man nodded firmly. "Exact words? Does it?" "Of there." An elderly woman in a red headscarf by the window raised her hand and said, "Last year, I was pulled over while grocery shopping. I asked what the problem was, and they said that exact line." Another person on the right side of the room stood up. "I heard the same thing." Maya flipped her notebook open, writing so fast the pen nearly tore the page. She asked, "Has anyone here heard that phrase from an officer named Lawson?" 7 people raised their hands. No hesitation. 7 individuals, each with a different story, all from the 3 zip codes Aaron had mentioned. And all of them quoted the same sentence, the one always tied to humiliation. "The rules don't apply to people like you." Maya scanned the room, faces worn out, but full of quiet determination. Like they had waited years just to speak out in a moment like this. A man in a faded shirt added, "I reported it once, but my file vanished. They told me I must have filed it wrong. It was on their pras." A young woman recalled being with her mother when an officer told them they were in the wrong place. When they asked for the officer's name to report him, he laughed and said, "Go ahead, I'll be waiting." The crowd began to turn into a pressure cooker. Rage and grief mixing in the air, building a kind of atmosphere that pressed down on the chest of everyone in the room. Maya stepped away from the corner of the room, walking along the row of chairs to gather a few final details. An elderly black man, sitting near the aisle, gently placed his hand on the armrest and spoke in a quiet voice. "I've lived long enough to know that line wasn't said out of impulse. That line was taught." The words made Maya stop in her tracks. She looked up, met his eyes, and saw something in them that resembled a truth buried for so long. Even those who lived through it no longer expected anyone to believe it. The meeting had lasted nearly 2 hours, and when it ended, no one wanted to leave right away. People kept sharing smaller stories, comparing incidents, searching for patterns. One person muttered under their breath, "If she hadn't been filmed, it would have all been buried." That made everyone around the table nod, as if they all knew that truth had existed far too long. Maya packed up her notebook, slipped her pen into her coat pocket, and stepped out onto the porch. The Atlanta night air carried the weight of mist and streetlights. She unlocked her phone and looked over the list. 7 people had confirmed the same exact phrase Lawson had used, and she realized they weren't just accusing one officer. They were describing a repeated pattern, passed down from one generation to the next within the same precinct. Back in her car, she typed one final note into her phone. "No doubt left, this is not an isolated case." She paused for a few seconds, then added a second line. "Need to review everyone car ever trained." Streetlights streaked across the car window like long ribbons of light, and Maya knew she had just opened a line of investigation that could bring even more into the open. Marjorie's story was only the beginning. And now the community had made one thing clear. They would no longer be treated as background in this city's story. Aaron Pierce opened his computer in the small office, tucked away at the end of the internal affairs hallway. Ever since sending the documents to Marjorie's lawyer, he had kept quiet in the precinct, working like nothing was wrong, trying not to show any sign of worry. But everything that happened at the town hall meeting and the information Maya aired on television made him more certain that this was all heading toward a point where it couldn't be covered up anymore. He began opening the batch of files the system had flagged for review, the kind no one wanted to touch because they were labeled sensitive data involved. The precinct's training assessment was the first thing he had to go through, and as he scrolled through each page, he noticed a strange logo in the top right corner of every document, a symbol of a horned beast in black, with small text underneath reading, "Manticore Shield, Ulging." He stared at the logo for a few more seconds, a strange feeling rising as he realized he had never seen this emblem in any official APD document. He kept opening more files one by one, and the logo appeared again and again in every training document from 2016 to 2021. Even the civilian control manual, something that should have been authored by Internal Affairs, carried the same symbol. Aaron frowned, muttering under his breath, "What is this?" He searched the APD's internal database, typing Manticore, then adding Shield. But nothing came up. It was as if that name had never officially existed in the system, except buried inside training paperwork. Curiosity rising, Aaron searched beyond the internal network and pulled up a few old news articles. He saw the names scattered across pieces from 3 years ago. Private company under investigation for aggressive training tactics. Private security firm Manticore Shield accused of overstepping authority. The articles described Manticore as a private security outfit that some smaller precincts had hired to teach suspect control techniques. There were claims that they trained officers to use more force than national standards allowed, and many of their trainees were reported for excessive use of power shortly after returning to their units. Aaron stopped when he got to the part describing one of their training programs. It clearly stated they used enhanced response techniques, teaching how to subdue suspects quickly by applying high pressure to weak points. That explained too much. It matched exactly what Lawson did in Marjorie's video. He leaned back, gripping the arm of his chair. This is where they learned it from. What should have been APD's own responsibility had been outsourced to a private company, one that had already been investigated for doing exactly this. He went on to check funding records, a kind of document he never expected to find Manticore's name in. But when he opened the list of units that had received equipment support, he saw the name right there beneath a grant For the North Atlanta Precinct. Manticore Shield. Emergency Response Equipment Support. Aid Year. 2017. Aaron leaned back, his palms sweating. They funded this precinct. That sentence wouldn't leave his head, because funding never came with pure intentions. It always meant something had been traded: preferential treatment, influence in training, or control in operations. Nervous and curious, he dug deeper. At the end of the funding file, there was a section for original contract records. Aaron opened it, slower than usual, as if he already knew something important was hiding in the faded text. The file appeared 3 poorly scanned pages, their edges yellowed with time. The first page listed the equipment. The second detailed the terms. But it was the third page that made Aaron shoot to his feet. The signature at the bottom, though a little smudged, was still readable. Sergeant William Carr. His heart pounded harder. Carr was the name in the case file on Marjorie's father's death, the one listed as on duty that night, the one described as a rookie trainer, the one tied to multiple redacted or altered reports. And now his name was on the funding contract between North Atlanta Precinct and a private company accused of teaching violent methods. Aaron reached out and touched the screen, eyes tightening. Carr, signed with Manticore. That sentence exploded inside the small room. He sat back down, trying to piece together the picture now forming. Carr had handled Samuel Hale's case as non-compliant, and that file had been sealed for nearly 30 years. Lawson, the man who attacked Marjorie, also came from this precinct and behaved exactly like someone trained by Manticore. 2 points, nearly 3 decades apart, connected by the same kind of violence, the same precinct, the same training pipeline. And now, with this contract, it wasn't speculation anymore. It was a link laid bare. Aaron stood up, locked his screen, took a copy of the contract, and placed it in his private drawer. He looked around the room, the walls seeming to close in. This wasn't information he could keep to himself anymore. It was a piece that could reshape the entire investigation. He took a long breath, then sat back down and picked up his phone. His hand shook, but he still dialed the number. The line picked up after a few seconds of silence, then a voice asked, "What's new?" Aaron answered in a low, heavy, and cautious voice. "There's something you need to see. And it starts with the man who killed your father." Brent Lawson sat in his car in the parking lot behind the precinct, windows rolled up high to avoid the eyes of anyone walking past. Just 2 days ago, he was still strutting through the building, shoulders straight, wearing a confident smile, believing the system was always behind him. But now, every footstep in the hallway felt like a message that everything had flipped. The internal meeting the other day was nothing like the times he'd been in trouble before. The brass avoided eye contact. A few officers nodded faintly in passing. No one patted him on the back like they used to. He felt the distance clearly, like they wanted to make sure that when things went bad, it would all land squarely on him. When he entered his office to call the police union, hoping for protection like before, the dispatcher's voice was short. "We're not getting involved right now." Lawson's face tightened. "What do you mean, not getting involved?" "I've paid dues for over 10 years." The voice on the other end stayed cold. "Your case is complicated. We need to review it." He slammed the desk, but the final words still came through. "You do not have union support at this time." The phone went dead, the long tone on the line sending a chill down his spine. He headed straight to his boss's office, determined to demand an explanation. His boss, the same one who always defended him when things went sideways, didn't offer him a seat this time, didn't even look up, just kept signing papers. Lawson tried to stay calm. "I need the team behind me. This is getting blown way out of proportion." The boss put the pen down and sighed, like he'd been waiting for this moment. Then he said something that knocked the air out of Lawson's lungs. "You've done too much damage. Nothing more. No excuses. No defense. Not even a raised eyebrow of sympathy. Just that short line, heavy as a stone." Lawson stood frozen for a few seconds, then asked in a faded voice, "You mean they've dropped me?" The boss looked up, eyes cold like glass. "We can't pull you out of this one." Lawson walked out of the office like the floor had vanished beneath him. His legs barely felt real. The phone in his pocket buzzed again and again. He opened it, hoping a coworker had texted to check in. But no. The first message was from an unknown number. "Nobody's gonna cover for you this time." The next, "You're on your own." Then, another, this one with a blurry screenshot of a video showing him twisting Marjorie's arm. Below it were the words, "Protect yourself." Lawson clenched his jaw, fingers tightening around the phone. He couldn't understand how it had all turned on him so fast. He had followed the playbook they'd all taught, handled things the way those before him had done for years. And now those same people were leaving him like he was never praised, never trained by them. When he stepped back into the break room, two officers who were chatting immediately went silent. One of them shifted his eyes off his phone, refusing to look at him. The other stood and walked out into the hallway, avoiding eye contact. Lawson threw his drink in the trash and sat down on the wooden bench in the corner, eyes on the floor. He tried to convince himself this was just the beginning. That in a few days things would settle down, the union would step in, and social media would find someone else to rage at. But deep down, he knew he was being pushed out of the protective circle that had always shielded him from the small things to the big ones. The phone buzzed again. Another message from an unsaved number. "They need someone to take the fall. It's your turn now." Lawson felt a chill at the back of his neck. He looked around the room. Everyone seemed busy, but a few glances passed quickly over him, then turned away, like they knew what was happening and wanted no part of it. He placed both hands on the table, heart pounding, feeling deeply betrayed. "Who's doing this to me?" he whispered. He thought back to the internal meeting. The deputy chief's look, the way he nodded too quickly to shelve the file, and how the boss said what he said without a second of hesitation. It all felt orchestrated. He left the break room, walked out into the hallway, and leaned against a metal file cabinet, hand on his forehead. From where he stood, he could see a group of younger officers walking quickly past, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing at him with wary eyes. He recognized that look. It was the look of people keeping their distance, making sure they wouldn't get pulled under when the ship sank. He used to give that same look to others. Now he was the one receiving it. Lawson left the precinct near dusk, the sky gray and heavy, casting an even darker shadow over his thoughts. He sat in his car for a long while, looking at his reflection in the rearview mirror, his face hollow, more worn than usual. The messages, the leadership's attitude, the indifference of his co-workers, all pieced together into something with a clear shape. Someone wanted to make him the scapegoat, not because they believed he was innocent, but because they needed someone to take the hit and protect the system now being torn open by the Marjorie case and the evidence spilling out. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt afraid, not of the public, but of the people behind him. The ones who used to stand by his side, now standing far enough away to push him off if they had to. Maya sat in the newsroom of the local TV station, a room filled with the sound of keyboards, ringing phones, and white lights casting a harsh glare across the desks that made her eyes ache. But she didn't notice. Her eyes locked on the list of incidents open on her laptop. After the town hall meeting, she had spent the entire night searching for cases with similar patterns over the past 20 years. 5 cases, different in time and place, but all sharing the same pattern. The victims were older black individuals, stopped or questioned for vague reasons, and the encounters ended in violence. The death of Mr. Samuel Hale was no longer a lone entry. It sat among the others, forming a red thread running through 2 decades. Maya opened each file, read old reports, reviewed short news clips the station had aired at the time, and compared them with information from local residents. The first case occurred in 1998, the victim labeled non-compliant. The second was in 2004, a man beaten and left with 2 broken ribs after being suspected of driving too slowly in a residential area. The third, in 2011, stated the subject lost balance during restraint. But witnesses told a different story. The remaining 2 were more recent, yet both had been closed quickly. She flipped back to images from Mr. Samuel Hale's case, a heavy feeling pressing in her chest, as if she were staring at the mark of something that was never meant to be publicly acknowledged. She left her desk and went to meet a former witness from the 2004 case, a man who had called the station after seeing Marjorie's story on TV. He lived in a small apartment in the south side of the city, his silver hair and thin frame making him look older than he likely was. When Maya asked about the incident, he stared down at the table for a long while before speaking. They called it field training. I heard an officer say that exact phrase. Maya narrowed her eyes. Where did you hear them say it? He replied, right while they were beating that man. One of the younger officers was fumbling with a move, and the older one said, let me show you. Consider it field training. That statement made Maya write it down immediately, her hand trembling slightly, because it was exactly how an unauthorized training program would operate under the radar. The witness said there had been about 4 officers on the scene, and they behaved like the incident was part of an apprenticeship program, not a real-world situation. I saw it, he said. It wasn't an accident. They wanted the rookie to see what was allowed. His words made Maya fall silent for a few seconds before she asked, do you remember anyone's name from that group? He shook his head. I remember one face, but not a name. Maya returned to the station and pulled up the files Aaron had shared with Marjorie's lawyer about the Manticore Shield organization. That information hadn't been made public yet, but now she had enough leads to dig further on her own. As she looked deeper, she found that Manticore had provided training programs in several states, from Texas to Kentucky. Some areas had cut ties after complaints from residents that officers became more aggressive following the courses. She read an article stating that Manticore not only trained, but also supplied equipment to some precincts. And wherever they operated, civilian complaints spiked within 2 years. She looked up at the whiteboard in the newsroom, where she had started sketching a basic timeline. The dots were beginning to connect. Mr. Samuel Hale's case occurred a few years after a group of officers at the precinct participated in a response enhancement course. The 2004 case happened in a zone with private company-sponsored programs. The 2011 incident coincided with Manticore expanding training contracts in Georgia. None of it was random anymore. Maya took a deep breath and closed her laptop, deciding to reach out to a former officer who had served at the North Atlanta precinct. Someone she knew had left the force after an internal conflict. He lived alone in a small house by the woods, far from the city center. When she arrived, he opened the door with caution. Maya introduced herself and explained why she had come. He invited her into a small but tidy living room. Maya spread the documents out on the table, pointed to the name Manticore, and asked, do you know anything about this program? He stared for a moment, then dropped into the chair, his voice rasping like it had been dragged out of memories best left buried. I know it, he said, and it was never officially recorded. Maya asked directly, are the cases I found all connected to that program? The former officer let out a sigh, eyes drifting toward the window. It started even before my time on the force. Field training wasn't just some casual phrase. That was how they passed down experience. Who to rough up, Who to stop? Letting rookies see how it's done. He tilted his head toward her, old eyes still sharp. You think Hale was the first they targeted? Maya paused her pen. The question struck hard, like the final snap in a puzzle. He continued, Mr. Samuel wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. They've been doing this a long time. The room thickened with the weight of the truth just spoken. Maya looked down at her notebook. What had once been scattered, dashes were now clear lines that couldn't be undone. Manticore, North Atlanta Precinct, the hidden acts of violence, and the death of Marjorie's father. All of it flowed together in a single, unbroken stream. She thanked the former officer and stepped outside, heart pounding heavier. Outside, the wind was strong, leaves falling in waves. Maya understood she had just stepped into a place few journalists dared to go, a place where every new piece of information was like a blade slicing through the curtain of a system that had hidden behind it for far too long. The elderly woman with silver hair, who had spoken up at the town hall meeting and who had also witnessed Lawson twist Marjorie's arm that day at the diner, left the meeting later than everyone else. The night air was still, the street empty, and the yellow light from the lamps fell softly on dry leaves along the walkway. She lived in a small house in the northern suburbs, nearly 4 miles from the diner. It was such a quiet area that a dog barking in the middle of the night would prompt neighbors to turn on their lights and check outside. She wasn't the type to scare easily. After living in Atlanta for over 40 years, she was used to all kinds of trouble. But this time, as she was unlocking the gate to her yard, she felt someone standing behind her. That strange sensation crept up her spine, like a cold stare pressing into her back. She turned around and looked down the long street leading out to the main road, no one in sight. But something was off. Her neighbor's house was completely dark, and the 2 bushes near her front walk trembled slightly, even though the wind wasn't strong enough to move them. She stepped into the yard slowly and locked the gate carefully behind her. But the feeling of being watched clung to her. As she reached the front door, she heard the soft crunch of small gravel under someone's foot behind her, quiet, but clear enough for someone with her years of experience to notice. She gripped the door handle tightly, pushed the door open, and shut it faster than usual. Her chest felt heavy. She told herself maybe she was just being overly sensitive after speaking in front of a whole crowd. But then, just as she turned on the living room light, she heard another sound, a light tapping on the window. She froze, her breathing shallow. She stepped over to the curtain and pulled it just enough to peek out. On the glass of the window facing the porch was a long scratch, the light catching on a thin piece of metal caught between the wooden frame. She realized it wasn't a random scrape. It was made by something hard and sharp, like someone had dragged a metal object across the window to make noise. A kind of message, a threat. Her heart clenched. She stepped back several paces, then reached for the landline phone. Her fingers trembled so much that she misdialed twice. Finally, she got through to the only person she could think of, Maya. The phone rang 3 times before Maya picked up, her voice slightly out of breath from just getting out of her car after work. "Are you okay?" she asked, the moment she heard the woman's labored breathing. "Someone's following me," the woman said, her voice shaky and hoarse. "I didn't see their face, but they're out in the yard." They tapped on the window. Maya tightened her grip on the phone and walked straight to her car without asking for more details. "Did you lock the doors?" she asked. "Yes," the woman answered, "but someone is still out there." Maya got in, started the engine, and made a sharp U-turn. "Stay away from the windows. I'm on my way." While driving, Maya called someone else, the only person who could explain this. Aaron. Aaron answered in a low voice, still at his office. But when Maya quickly said that the diner witness was being threatened, he paused for a few seconds, then spoke slowly and firmly. "Are there any marks on the glass?" Maya asked the woman through the speakerphone, and she described the long metal scrape and the shard left behind. When she finished, Aaron replied almost without hesitation, "That's not some kid messing around. That's Manticore technique." Maya hit the gas. "You're sure?" Aaron sighed. "I'm sure. That's how they send a warning. No break-ins, no major evidence left behind. Just enough for the person inside to know they're being watched." In a Kerad, Maya reached the woman's house in 8 minutes. The roads were quiet, so every movement stood out. When she arrived, the porch light was still on, and the woman stood several feet away from the window just as Maya had instructed. Maya entered the house, locked the door, and pulled the thick curtains tightly across the glass. Then she stepped out onto the porch to examine things up close. Next to the long scrape on the window, there was a faint shoe print on the ground, right by the path near the porch. It didn't look like a normal walking shoe. It resembled a tactical boot, with a thicker sole and an uncommon tread pattern. Maya looked down the street. No one was there, but the feeling that someone had just been standing in that exact spot moments before chilled her to the bone. The old woman sat down in the armchair, her hands clasped together. "I know this tactic," she said quietly. "They just want me scared and silent." Maya placed a hand on her shoulder. "You won't be silent. No one gets to silence you." But deep down, Maya knew this was no longer just about a video circulating online. It had become a matter involving people willing to threaten witnesses to protect something much bigger. Maya called Aaron again, putting him on speaker so the old woman could hear. "Be more specific," she said. "Why would they threaten an old woman just for speaking about what she saw?" Aaron replied, his voice tired like he'd been carrying an invisible weight all day. "Manticore doesn't just teach technique. They teach how to create silence. Anyone they think might sway public opinion, they intimidate first. No hitting, no breaking. Just enough for the person to know they're being watched." Maya looked around the quiet house, every shadowed corner making her alert. But how did they know she was a witness? Aaron didn't hesitate. They watched the video, cross-referenced it with the list of customers from traffic cameras around Buckhead. "They're fast." His words seemed to shrink the room. The old woman looked up at Maya, eyes filled with both helplessness and anger. "I didn't know they tracked people like that," she whispered. Maya gave her hand a light squeeze. "But we're not going to let them get away with it." Even as she said it, Maya knew this situation had veered into more dangerous territory. The old woman was just the first. Anyone brave enough to speak out could be next. When Maya led the woman to her bedroom and locked the door, she took one last look out the porch window. The road outside was silent, but she felt as if someone had just been there, watching like a figure lurking in shadow, never showing their face. Maya locked the door, returned to the living room, and sat down facing the old woman. "You won't be here alone tonight," she said. The woman nodded, eyes lowered to the floor. In that small room, they both understood that Marjorie's story had moved far beyond a diner scene. It had reached into the places where darkness was used to hiding, and anyone who stepped into the light would now have to face that darkness head-on. The APD internal hearing room was on the top floor, not large, but just tight enough that anyone sitting inside instinctively sat up straight. Marjorie entered in a neat outfit, her lawyer beside her, calm-eyed but sharp, like someone ready for any evasive question the police might throw. At the long table in the center, 4 people were already seated. The head of disciplinary affairs, the deputy chair, and 2 legal representatives of APD. All of them looked up as she entered. A quick, guarded glance, like they didn't know whether to categorize her as a victim or a threat. The hearing began with the flat voice of the chair. "We're holding this meeting to clarify the recent incident at Buckhead Diner. According to the initial report, this was simply an unfortunate misunderstanding." He said it slowly and carefully, avoiding direct eye contact, as if he had repeated the same script hundreds of times throughout his career. Unfortunate misunderstanding was the phrase APD had used in many past cases, a line meant to downplay the actions of the wrongdoer and dampen public emotion. Marjorie listened without blinking. Her lawyer dipped her head slightly, offering a cold smile. Marjorie placed both hands on the table and spoke with clarity and composure. "I understand how you want to frame this, but before you conclude anything, you need to see this. I have daughters." She opened her bag and pulled out an old case file, its paper cover faded with age. The room changed instantly. No one had expected her to bring anything, especially not something so painfully familiar to anyone who'd been with APD long enough. The file was labeled Samuel Hale. Marjorie placed it on the table, so lightly it seemed weightless. Yet the moment the cover touched wood, the room fell silent. Her lawyer slid the file across to the chair. "Mrs. Hale wishes to add this to the hearing record. It concerns the death of her father, processed by this very precinct in the year 1994. The chair touched the file like it was something hot, his fingers recoiling slightly before he opened to the first page. When his eyes hit the line, "Cause of death, non-compliance," he froze. The deputy leaned in to see as well, then flipped to the crime scene photos, his eyes widening before he forced his expression back to neutral. The photo showed what anyone with field experience would recognize immediately: that death was not the result of so-called non-compliance. No matter what the report said, no more pen tapping, no more rustling of papers. Marjorie sat across from them, her face free of anger, only a deep sadness that was difficult to read. She spoke softly. "Samuel Hale was my father. He died during a police encounter handled by North Atlanta Precinct. I never received any explanation besides one sentence: non-compliance." Her hand rested on the folder, her fingertip touching a note stamped on the cover: "Do not open without state-level clearance." The chair swallowed hard, his eyes shifting toward the legal counsel, as if hoping someone would step in to defuse the moment. But the legal reps stayed silent, their expressions uneasy, like people looking at something they had hoped never to see. Time stretched a few extra seconds in the room. Then the deputy carefully turned to the last page of the old file, where the list of officers on duty that night was printed. 2 names were blacked out, but the third remained clear: Sergeant William Carr, the same man who had signed the contract with Manticore Shield, the same man mentioned in a scandal that had been buried for years. Marjorie tilted her head toward the deputy, her voice steady, like she was drawing a straight line between 2 generations. "Carr belonged to this precinct, and who trained under his methods, I don't think I need to say." Her words landed, and the room fell into absolute stillness. Everyone knew exactly which name she was referring to, and no one wanted to deny that truth. A younger officer, seated at the end of the table, stared hard at the old list. He flipped through the pages, back and forth, as if trying to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. His face shifted from calm to tense, until he couldn't hold it in any longer. He spoke up, not loudly, but enough for everyone to turn toward him. The name Lawson was marked by Hale Sr. back in '94. The division chief whipped his head toward the young officer, face gone pale like someone just yanked out of their seat. Marjorie's lawyer turned to look at her, his eyes confirming it. Every thread from the past to the present had lined up. The young officer continued, his voice slightly shaky, knowing he had just said something that wasn't supposed to be spoken in a meeting like this. "The internal tag, Hale Senior Accesses, comes from that case back then. It's part of the data group linked to Carr. Which means..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room understood. An old model from 3 decades ago had spread into the present. Samuel's death had never been an accident. And Marjorie's case was never an isolated incident. Lawson, the man who twisted her arm in the diner, was a late product of the same system that killed her father. The division chief slammed the file shut louder than he meant to. The sound hitting the table echoed through the closed room like a jolt, dragging everyone back to the present. He looked around, head lowered like a man who knew this hearing had just slipped out of his control. Marjorie sat upright, as calm as she had been from the beginning. She didn't raise her voice, didn't demand an apology, didn't challenge anyone. She just stayed silent, letting them all see clearly what they had spent years covering up. Her lawyer pulled the file toward him, stacked the pages neatly, then said one final sentence: "Mrs. Hale is not looking for pity. She wants the truth." As they stood to leave the room, no one from the APD leadership moved for several seconds. The door closed behind Marjorie, leaving a weight in the hearing room as heavy as lead. Everyone understood clearly from the moment that old file hit the table, they could no longer wrap this story in the word misunderstanding. Aaron Pierce sat alone in his small office, the door tightly shut, the glow of the computer screen casting light over his tense face. Since Marjorie's hearing, he had barely slept. Every footstep in the hallway startled him, because he knew what he was digging into could bring down an entire system. He reopened the sealed data vault again, this time using high-level access he had obtained through a loophole in the admin system. After entering the final access code, a series of files appeared marked as deleted. He had to manually run a recovery tool, piece by piece. The computer roared as if warning him to stop, but he let it run. After nearly half an hour, the software reported about 60% data recovery. The documents came back fragmented, some missing entire halves, some blurred, some reduced to a few lingering lines. Aaron opened the first file. The title was still intact: Program RISE. He read the description line slowly. Routine Implicit Suppression Enforcement. A program with a name that sounded like standard security protocol, but every word pointed clearly to covert control. He scrolled into the content and found instructor guidelines. Identify individuals likely to destabilize. Apply pressure-driven contact methods. Engage with high-force tactics from the first encounter to reduce resistance. These instructions were almost identical to the method Lawson had used in the video with Marjorie. He opened the program's operational timeline, faded, but readable. The years were listed: 1992, 1999, 2003, 2010, 2017. Each year had a note: Method Review, and all of them named Manticore Shield as the technical overseer. Aaron leaned back, feeling the pieces in his mind start to lock into place. The RISE program wasn't new. It had been running silently for 3 decades under multiple APD commanders. What happened to Marjorie's father in 1994 and the incidents that followed weren't isolated events. They were outcomes of a framework maintained year after year. He went on to recover the target data section. The file opened slower than usual, as if something was resisting. When the contents finally appeared, Aaron read the first line and froze. The heading Priority Zones listed a string of zip codes, exactly the neighborhoods he had already mentioned to Marjorie's lawyer. Each zone had a list of names, some redacted, some faded, but 4 were still clear. Aaron enlarged the screen. Hale appeared on 4 different target sheets across different years. They hadn't marked her family once. They had done it 4 times. 4 generations of documentation. 4 sets of lists. He swiped across the screen, heart pounding. On the first list, Hale's senior access was in the priority column, just like he had seen in the quota documentation. On the second list, from 2003, Hale was still present, though it was unclear to whom it referred. The third list, dated 2011, placed the name under Risk Profile. The final list, from 2017, showed the name half erased, But Aaron didn't need to see the full line to know what it meant. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "Jesus," he whispered, as if refusing to believe what he had just uncovered. 4 target lists, spanning 3 decades, all carrying her family name. This was no longer a case of citizen monitoring. It was a generational database, tracking families they intended to control. People treated as potential threats, simply for the color of their skin or where they lived. Aaron opened another tab to compare the years those names appeared with major APD incidents, and almost instantly, the connection was clear. Every time the Hale name showed up, that same year there had been a violent case or complaint in neighborhoods of older black residents. It wasn't coincidence. The RISE program, Manticore, the hidden training modules, the scrubbed reports of abuse, all part of the same line. He grabbed his phone, stepped out of the office to avoid internal cameras, and called Marjorie's lawyer. As soon as the call was answered, Aaron spoke, his voice low and tight, barely able to stay composed. "I found the deleted files. They labeled the victims as targets. The program is called RISE." He paused for a few seconds, needing to find the right words. And the name Hale appears on 4 separate lists. From 1994 to 2017. Was Sitchers of Beeses. On the other end, the lawyer stayed silent for a few beats, as if wind had just rushed past his ear. Aaron continued, "This isn't one case. Not one officer. This is a program that ran for 30 years. He said, the last part, with a weight in his chest like a stone. They flagged her family before Lawson ever joined the force. He sat down on the steps near the emergency exit. The space was dim. The hallway lights had been cut to half power to save energy. For years, Aaron had worked internal affairs, believing he understood the system. But that night, with 4 target lists and a string of erased reports, he knew he had just touched something that generations before him had never wanted anyone to see. And he also knew, once a truth like this came to light, there was no going back. The security camera at the Fulton County Courthouse parking lot captured a moment that only a handful of people would ever see. It was already dark. The lot was empty, the rows of sodium lights spilling patchy yellow across the misted pavement. A thin figure, slightly hunched, wearing a black hoodie, entered the frame from the top right corner. He moved so silently, it was as if he made no sound at all. Each step low and deliberate, like someone used to avoiding detection. No one was lingering nearby, and the security guard on duty was busy on a phone call inside the glass booth, not looking outside. The figure approached Marjorie's silver sedan, paused briefly, slipped his left hand into his pocket, and gently placed a small yellow envelope under the windshield wiper. He tilted his head up slightly, as if checking camera angles, then turned and walked away quickly, disappearing behind a row of parked cars within seconds. The next morning, Marjorie left the courthouse after a meeting with her attorney. As she reached her car, she opened the door and then spotted the envelope wedged beneath the wiper. She stood still for a few seconds, eyes narrowing in instinctive caution from someone long used to living carefully. She reached out and removed the envelope. Inside, she felt something flat and firm. Her attorney, seeing the movement from behind, stepped up quickly. "Is something wrong?" Marjorie opened the envelope right there. Inside was a small, black USB with no label. Alongside it was a small folded note, the handwriting sharp and slanted, reading, "The pattern survives through orders." The attorney frowned. "Who sent this?" Marjorie didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed on the line of text, as if reading a second meaning beneath the words. She folded the paper, placed both items into her bag. "Let's go see." Isel recorded about Contrasen. They got into the car and drove straight to the attorney's office, where there was a secure workspace and a computer not connected to the APD network. The attorney plugged in the USB. A single folder appeared on screen, labeled 2000. He opened it. One body cam video file was inside, dated 2 decades ago. The footage slightly shaky. The color faded from the tech of that era. As the video began to play, the room filled with the static buzz of body cam audio. The opening shot showed a street in southwest Atlanta at night, patrol car lights flashing against the road. A male officer's voice came through deep, slow. But the way he emphasized each word made both viewers glance at each other. The tone was disturbingly similar to Lawson's. In the footage, the officer shouted in the face of an older black man being pulled from a vehicle. "Rules don't apply to people like you. Let me retrain you." Marjorie heard that sentence and her spine went stiff. It was identical to what Lawson had said to her at the diner, word for word, as if pulled from the same source. The attorney replayed the segment slowly. The footage shook, but it was still clear enough to see the man being shoved against the side of the car, both arms forced behind his back. The officer leaned in with heavy elbows to pin him down, his voice steady, not out of control, but practiced, routine. Marjorie gently touched the screen and murmured, "Same way of hitting?" The attorney nodded. "So similar it's like they were trained exactly the same." As the video neared its end, just after the victim was placed on the stretcher, the body cam tilted down toward the officer's face. The image was blurry, but the signature in the scanned report attached to the file was clear. It read, "Officer Raymond Stokes." The lawyer blinked. This name. He pulled up an old file on his computer, then another. Raymond Stokes died 10 years ago. Car accident on the interstate. Marjorie stared at the signature, then at the body cam footage fading to black. But the voice sounds like Lawson. The lawyer sat up straight. So similar that if I didn't know the year this was recorded, I'd say it was Lawson himself. They both stayed silent for a few seconds, letting the pieces they had just seen settle into shape. Not one person, but many. Not one generation, but several generations of officers. All using the same lines, the same methods, the same kind of pressure, a current running from the year 2000 to the year Lawson joined the force, to the moment his hand gripped her wrist in the diner. A chain not built on individuals, but on a system. And that system had lasted longer than the people carrying it out. The lawyer zoomed in on Officer Stokes's signature, then pulled up the attached metadata. In the scanned file was a note, Training Division RISE Program. Right beneath it, the instructor's confirmation signature read, Sergeant William Carr. They didn't need to say another word. Carr again, the man connected to her father's case in 1994, the man who had signed a contract with Manticore, the one in charge of rookie training at the time. And now, a body cam from the year 2000 showed an officer acting precisely in the mold Carr had overseen. Marjorie let out a breath, her voice low but sharp. The man is dead, but the voice still lives, because the next one repeats the last. The lawyer pushed his chair back and stood, pacing the room, hands on his hips. That note in the envelope? The pattern survives through orders? They meant even if one man dies, another follows the same orders. The same way. Maya called, at that moment. The lawyer answered, and turned on speaker so Marjorie could hear. When they described the body cam footage, Maya said only one thing. If this pattern has lasted through 3 generations of officers, then that envelope wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Marjorie looked toward the window. The Atlanta evening light slanting into the corner of the room, pale and soft. Someone wants us to see, she said, but doesn't want to show their face. All 3 understood the envelope wasn't the act of an enemy. It was a signal from someone in the shadows. Someone with deeper information than APD was willing to admit. Someone who knew this system of violence didn't begin with Lawson, and it certainly wasn't going to end with him. The lawyer turned off the body cam footage. We keep everything, because this part is going to explode in court. Marjorie nodded, her eyes sharp and calm. She lightly gripped the note that read, "The pattern survives through orders," as if holding evidence of an invisible network that had finally, unknowingly, revealed its own shape. Maya drove to the southern suburbs, where she had arranged to meet a former employee of Manticore Shield. The man introduced himself as Calvin, just over 50, thin, with sharp eyes like someone who had spent years inside a system he no longer wanted to speak about. He lived in a small wooden house, curtains always drawn. When Maya knocked, he peeked through the curtain slit, then opened the door slowly, as if any unfamiliar sound might bring danger. "You're a reporter," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Maya nodded and showed her press badge. Calvin looked around the neighborhood before inviting her in. The living room was bare. Just a wooden table and a few boxes of old documents. When she asked about Manticore and R.I.S.E., he closed his eyes for a few seconds, as if weighing whether to reopen memories he had locked away for years. At last, he leaned over, rummaged through a cardboard box, and placed a small notebook on the table. "You want to know what R.I.S.E. is?" he said. "Then you need to understand this first." He pointed to the line at the top of the first page. Maya looked down. R.I.S.E. is not training, it is a philosophy. She looked up, frowning. Calvin explained in a steady, low voice. "They use the word training, so no one would question it. But in truth, it's an operational philosophy, a belief that force comes first in control. People in the R.I.S.E. program aren't taught anything new. They're made to reabsorb old bias in a new structure, with process, with targets, with priority lists." Maya turned the page and saw terms like establish dominance immediately, assume threat as default, respond below, alert threshold. The entire document resembled a tactical operations manual more than any civilian. Engagement protocol. Calvin said the program embedded itself in police departments by providing equipment grants, then inserting field training sessions like the ones described by community members. "When someone overreacts," he said, "they're not seen as making a mistake. They're seen as doing it right according to the model. You get it now." Maya felt her throat dry. She asked softly, "Who approved this program?" Calvin shook his head. "I only know one thing. It doesn't run for 30 years unless someone high up in APD gave it the green light." While Maya spoke with Calvin, across the city Aaron sat in his small office, closely reading through more recovered files. He no longer needed to stitch the pieces together by now. The picture had assembled itself. He opened the structural chart for the R.I.S.E. program and found sections for receiving units, coordinating units, and oversight units. Each section had abbreviations, but some acronyms repeated across multiple years. In the oversight group, one abbreviation appeared 8 times over 2 decades. N.A.C. Aaron opened the appendix for acronyms, but N.A.C. had no listed definition, so he began cross-referencing senior APD leadership titles. Slowly, a clear pattern emerged. 3 consecutive deputy directors of APD, all had names beginning with N. He opened internal personnel files, scanning leadership rosters over the years. When his eyes landed on one name, his breath caught. Deputy Director Nathan Cole. This man had been one of the few leaders linked to Manticore Shield during the equipment funding phase. He had also authorized external partners to assist with precinct training. And most importantly, his signature appeared on several documents that had been deleted, then recovered. Aaron stared at the screen. The final connection lit up like a spotlight against a wall. Lawson was not the central figure. He was a low-level link in a system that had been running for 30 years. He didn't come up with the line, "Rules don't apply to people like you." He learned it from a script that had already existed, handed down by those before him, modeled by Carr and Stokes, embedded in the very philosophy of R, I, S, E. But the person who kept that system alive, the one behind it all, was someone at a level Lawson would never dare to reach. Someone with the authority to ensure R, I, S, E survived through 3 generations of officers. As Aaron placed his hand on the table, his phone buzzed. It was Maya. He answered. Her voice was low but steady. R, I, S, E isn't a training course. It's a philosophy. They train officers to see the public as a threat. Aaron looked at the list of leadership on his screen and replied, I found out who's behind it. Maya went quiet for a moment, as if bracing for a truth she already knew would blow the story wide open. Aaron spoke slowly, word by word. Someone high up in APD has been approving RISE operations for 30 years. One of them is Nathan Cole. On the other end, Maya inhaled sharply, like several major puzzle pieces had just snapped into place. That means Lawson was just the bottom layer. Aaron nodded, though Maya couldn't see it. And Mrs. Hale's father. He was on the target list back when he was still active. The room around Aaron was so silent, he could hear the hum of the air conditioning. He knew this investigation was no longer about Marjorie getting her arm twisted in a diner. It had become an exposé of a system that had been in place for 3 decades, a system that never had a name. Maya ended the call and sat still in her car, eyes fixed forward, as if she could now see the full shape of the structure. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just a handful of officers going too far. This was a system that was created, maintained, funded, protected, and passed down from one generation to the next. And the people crushed by it, from Samuel Hale to Marjorie, had been on the list for a very long time. The Atlanta evening cast a pale orange hue across the windshield. Maya placed both hands on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of a decision that was coming. Because when a system protected for 30 years finally reveals its face, the only thing left to do is drag it into the light, no matter how big the shadow behind it may be. The federal courtroom was packed to the point that every spectator seat was taken, and rows of people stood along both walls, forming a dense, silent line. No one spoke loudly, but the air in the room was so heavy that even the sound of strained breathing could be heard. At the defendant's table, Brent Lawson sat with a pale face and hunched shoulders, as if everything that once made him arrogant had been drained away. He used to walk into any room with the presence of, I am the law. But today, the crowd's silence made him seem like an unwanted shadow under the white fluorescent lights. Across from him, Marjorie sat beside her attorney, hands calmly folded in front of her, eyes cold but steady, like someone who had waited 30 years for this trial. The prosecutor stood and walked to the podium, his voice even but edged with steel. Officer Lawson, I'll be direct. Who taught you the phrase, law doesn't apply to your kind? A soft murmur rippled through the room, and several spectators leaned forward, waiting to see if he would dare answer. Lawson swallowed hard, avoiding all eye contact, staring only at the table. The prosecutor repeated the question, firmer this time, hitting each word like a hammer. Who taught you that line? Lawson closed his eyes for a second, then opened them slowly, as if dragging fear up from his chest. His voice came out hoarse. It was from the training. The room broke into a stunned murmur. He continued, I didn't make it up. It was in the field course. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. What course? Lawson's hands shook. The response enhancement course, from back in the 90s. We were told it was an old method, but still effective. The prosecutor stepped closer. Where did that old method come from? Lawson pressed his lips together, as if trying to hold back something he could no longer contain. From the R.I.S.E. program. The APD attorney turned to object, but the judge raised a hand to allow it. The prosecutor pulled up a screen showing a page from the old USB Maya had uncovered, clearly labeled Routine Implicit Suppression Enforcement. You call this training, the prosecutor said, but it's a suppression model. Lawson inhaled sharply. We were taught to establish dominance immediately, so the subject would know their place. The prosecutor pressed again. And who told you that was the right way? Lawson didn't answer right away. A vein in his temple pulsed visibly. His mouth opened, then closed, fighting itself. The prosecutor leaned in, voice tightening. Who taught you to use that phrase on civilians? Who approved the program? Who told you that this was how we do things at this precinct? Lawson clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He looked around the room, as if someone present terrified him more than the verdict. The prosecutor tilted his head. What are you afraid of? The court protects you. No one in this room has the right to threaten you. Lawson gave a twisted little laugh. You don't get it. What I'm afraid of isn't sitting in here. It sits where the whole system takes its orders from. In the press row, Maya gripped her notepad tightly. Aaron stood at the back, eyes locked on Lawson. Marjorie stared straight ahead, not with anger, but with a steel-like resolve. The prosecutor placed an old case file on the podium. Mrs. Hale brought this to court. Do you know what it is? Lawson glanced at it, and his face changed when he saw the faded cover. The case of her father, the prosecutor continued. Mr. Samuel Hale, 1994. Same precinct as yours. Same model. Same command. Do you think that's a coincidence? Marjorie's attorney stood and submitted additional evidence. Crime scene photos. A memo marked, "Do not open without state-level clearance." And the 1994 roster that included the name Sergeant William Carr. The prosecutor turned back to Lawson. One last time, who approved this system? Who taught you that elderly black citizens were targets? Who passed this order down for 3 decades? The APD attorney jumped up. Objection. But the judge banged the gavel. The accused has the right to answer. The room went completely silent. Lawson breathed heavily, his shoulders rising as if he had reached a line he never intended to cross. He looked down, then looked up for the first time, meeting Marjorie's eyes. In that moment, Marjorie didn't see the man who slammed her into the wall at the diner. She saw a fragment of fear collapsing under the weight of truth. Lawson spoke quiet, but clear. I didn't think I'd ever have to say this. He glanced toward the APD leadership row, where the faces of senior officers were frozen in tense discomfort they couldn't hide. Then Lawson said, slowly, like slicing the room open, "The person behind it is Deputy Director Nathan Cole. It is Sintel." A deep gasp rolled across the room. Several people stood up. The judge struck the gavel repeatedly. The prosecutor stepped back half a pace, rocked by a revelation that shifted the entire trial. The name Nathan Cole, the highest-ranking APD official still in office, hit the room with enough weight to make the walls feel like they shook. Lawson went on, as if a knot had finally broken in his throat. I didn't choose how to do things. I followed what I was taught. From Carr's mentor. From the one who upgraded the program. From Cole. He approved R.I.S.E. He said, some areas need hard control. That wasn't the first time he said it. Marjorie closed her eyes briefly, not from pain, but because the truth had finally walked itself through the courthouse door. The prosecutor rested a hand on the podium, looking at Lawson as if staring into the heart of the system. "You've just revealed something that changes this case completely. This is no longer about one man. This is about a structure." Lawson nodded slowly. "Yes, a structure. And I am the bottom layer of it." The courtroom erupted like dry grass hit by wind-blown fire. The judge called for order, but the shock had already rippled through every row. Maya scribbled furiously, capturing every word. Aaron stood motionless, but in his eyes was something like recognition. Like the picture had finally come into full view. Marjorie breathed slowly, looked up at the judge, then back at Lawson. She said nothing. But on her face was a sentence that spoke for 3 decades of silence. At last, someone had said it. The federal court had just announced a temporary suspension of several officers and launched a nationwide investigation, but the shockwaves from the hearing were still rippling across Atlanta like cracks under asphalt after an earthquake. In front of APD headquarters, reporters crowded together, microphones pointed in every direction, while the officers who had just heard Lawson name Nathan Cole walked out with pale faces. No one spoke. No one dared look straight into the camera. A part of the APD collapsed that very morning. Dozens of files related to RISE were sealed, and the Manticore Shield contracts were handed over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Black FBI vehicles lined up in front of the building, agents stepping out with an urgency they didn't bother to hide. The door, once considered untouchable by the city's police machine, now stood open to the largest investigation Atlanta had seen in 3 decades. Maya stood beside Aaron on the curb, recording every development. "We just kicked the biggest hornet's nest in the city," she said quietly. Aaron replied, eyes fixed on the agents loading documents into their cars. "And it hasn't even fully broken open yet." Reporters from neighboring states poured in, many asking Maya about her sources, but she only shook her head and kept working. Meanwhile, upstairs, a line of executive office doors inside the APD was sealed off with yellow tape. A sight no one ever thought they would witness. Nathan Cole had vanished from headquarters immediately after Lawson named him. Rumors claimed he left the city in a private vehicle that same night, leaving behind a question mark over who was truly behind the RISE network. That afternoon, Marjorie left the courthouse in silence, avoiding the media. She didn't want to become a media symbol or have her story twisted into some cheap political slogan. She returned home through the back alley, away from the crowds, stepping onto her porch with tired legs but eyes that hadn't lost their strength. As she neared her car, she paused. Tucked beneath the windshield wiper was another envelope smaller than the last, thinner, but made from the same type of paper. She looked around. No one was on the street. A soft breeze blew past, the oak tree in front of her home casting a faint shadow across the path. She bent down and pulled the envelope out. No writing, no stamp, no logo on the outside. But inside was a folded slip of paper and a black and white photo. She opened the note first. Just 5 handwritten words, slanted and firm. "We're not done." She straightened up. Her heart didn't race, but her mind started running through all the possibilities she knew not to rule out. She unfolded the photo. It was a frame from a very old video, grainy and blurred, but the face in it was clear enough. Deep-set eyes, sharply angled brows, and a gaze as stern as a blade. Marjorie tightened her grip slightly on the photo. This was the man from the 1994 case file. A witness who had once been erased from the records. The figure standing behind the patrol car the night her father died. The photo in the first envelope didn't show the sender, but this time, security footage from the parking lot had captured a clearer moment, just enough for her to recognize those eyes from this image. She went inside, placed the envelope on the table, and opened her laptop to review the footage the law office had extracted. A hooded figure approached her car, crouched to place the envelope. then looked up for exactly 1 second before walking away. 1 second, just long enough for the light to catch half the face. Not the full image, but those eyes were unmistakable. She reopened the old photo, comparing. Same gaze, same depth, the same alertness of someone who had lived long, with secrets since the days her father served. Her lawyer entered the room, seeing her staring at the photo. "Do you recognize someone?" he asked. Marjorie didn't answer immediately. She set the picture on the table and lightly touched the corner with her fingertip, as if reconnecting a circuit that had broken 3 decades ago. "He was there the day my father died," she said slowly, "and now he's the one sending envelopes." The lawyer frowned. "You mean this man is helping?" Marjorie didn't nod or shake her head. "Either he's leading the way," she said, "or he's clearing the path for himself." He looked at her. "We tell the FBI," she answered instantly, voice hard as stone. "Tell them. But don't expect they'll reach him before he wants to be reached." That night, the city outside her window glowed beneath the streetlights, the distant sound of cars, like the breath of a place trying to understand what had just landed on its head. Marjorie stood by the glass, the 2 envelopes sitting on the table behind her, 2 messages from the dark. One a warning, one a confirmation that things were far from over. She looked at the city the way someone stares at a riddle that's halfway solved. What Lawson had confessed was only the top layer. What the FBI had just started to investigate was only what they could see. But the thing behind it, the thing that had lasted 30 years and lived through generations of officers, was still intact. Marjorie took a deep breath, the streetlight casting a glow on her face. No rage, no trembling, just the steady resolve that had built up since the day she saw her father come home in a black bag. She spoke softly to the city, cloaked in the night wind, a sentence meant for no one, but clear enough that she could hear it herself. "I'm not done. This time, it ends." As she turned back into the house, her shadow stretched long across the floor like a trail of ink. And though someone out there was watching, trying to guide or trying to warn, she knew. The next chapter was no longer just the Hale family's story. This was the city's fight now, and she was walking into it without looking back.